thanks for the invite. And I'm on sabbatical at the moment, and one thing that I'm doing is doing a research project on creative industries, the visual effects bit of it, and so LA seemed an appropriate place to be, but it's also that every winter I go in search of something to relieve the Scottish depression that comes down with the winter, so hence the Australia trips, but it's nice to be here. I emailed Chris the other day and said, you know, what should I assume about what people know about labour process theory and research, and amongst other things he said, no long march through Braverman and Borrowboy. So, not that I was...
I said no long trudge.
Trudge or march might be too Maoist in its implications, but no long anything. I wasn't actually planning to go on an even short march through this, but so I promised that the words Braverman and Braverman, as you say it, Borrowboy, will...
G-Pon wants to be educated.
Will not pass my lips. Maybe once or twice, tops. I was saying over lunch that I actually got this email from an undergraduate student in Chicago a couple of days ago saying, I read your Nature of Work book. I did this originally in 1983. Has anything been written since on the labour process? So, which kind of highlights the fact that, you know, we seem in the UK and to some extent in Northern Europe seem to have taken over the mantle created in the US and the wave of labour process research in the 70s and 80s. In fact, I turned up to a conference, a labour process conference in Binghamton. You weren't there, were you?
No, but I remember that.
1998. There was only 4 people outside the US turned up, so 4 of us came. And the people there still thought the labour process theory was theirs. And we were interlopers, and were actually massively surprised and unsympathetic when we said things like, actually, we've been debating that for the past 20 years, and this is the research on it. And they went, no, we didn't really want to know that. We did this stuff, and it's ours. So, never went back. So, click, please. Actually, they haven't had a conference since either, so we haven't had anything to go back to. But as Chris says, we have our International Labour Process Conference at Rutgers next year. So, let me say a few things about context and content. Most of this is going to be about contemporary research carried out by labour process scholars in UK and Europe more generally, but set in a bit of context. I don't want to overdo the Darwinian metaphors here. Merely wanted to say something about why I think labour process theory has survived and is arguably thriving across the pond. Part of this is to do with institutional peculiarities. We've had this labour process conference which began in the early 80s, and next year will be its 28th year. And if you have a conference, you create a framework and a sense of momentum. There's 24 books being produced as an association with the conference, and you know that helps to, in a sense, explain its survival. The journal, the top journal on work and employment in the UK, Work, Employment and Society is a journal that has generally been controlled. I don't want to overemphasize the word control there, but run by labour process people. It's currently run by a group from Strathclyde, my own university, and that's regarded as, you know, pretty top journal in Europe. But, you know, no amount of institutional embeddedness can save something becoming irrelevant if it doesn't have something to say. So my argument today is going to be that there's two things which explain its intellectual durability. One is what I've called a defensible core, a core theory, which I'll come on to in a minute, which, although it has some defects, explains its capacity for resilience. In other words, if you have a defensible set of core concepts which influence people's research, then you're going to stick around. If you don't have a defensible core, you're going to die. Then it has a distinctive set of concepts and modes of inquiry, a particular way of doing things, again, which one can see defects in, which I will get to, particularly that are orientated towards ethnographic and other qualitative case studies, which have created a kind of capacity for renewal. Can we move on? So let me say something about...
Wait, you skipped
No,
one.
you skipped one there.
I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Development of core theory. There's been a lot of debate on this, which I will not bore you with. But generally refer to second wave analysis as that analysis which followed the period of Braverman and his followers. So I've used up one of my Braverman references, and I promise there'll only be possibly one more. The period, if you like, of the supposedly classic studies, Richard Edwards, Burrowoy, used up my Burrowoy reference now, and UK-based authors, Littler, Friedman, and so on. What these people were doing, largely speaking, was developing typologies of workplace regimes. This is what became known to some extent as the control and resistance model, though the notion of consent and other employee practices and responses were inserted in that process at the same time. And there's some excellent studies that probably people are less aware of, like Paul Edwards, the leading British employee relations writer, and Scullion in the 80s, looking at workplace regimes, historical patterns, differences according to types of capitalism, sector, and so on. Now, at the end of the 1980s, as US social scientists appeared to lose interest in the topic, the rest of us tried to make some sense of it. So there was a book came out in 1990 called Labour Process Theory, in which there was an attempt by a number of writers, including myself, to excavate a core theory from these first two waves of research and writing. Part of there's a couple of purposes. One was to disentangle labour process perspectives from the idea that the theory was basically Taylorism plus de-skilling equals work trends. And that quickly, those arguments quickly sank when sustained waves of research were done in the 1980s. But it was also partly to separate the theory from, by then, the huge welter of case studies which had been done particularly in Europe, but also in the US. So literally hundreds and hundreds of doctoral students who've done their study and want, I've just done a study of X plant and there wasn't any de-skilling. Therefore, Braverman is wrong. Oh, God, I've said it 3 times now. Therefore, various people are wrong. And of course, what you get then is a huge welter of these things, so nobody knows where they are. So at the end of this period, there's an attempt to say, well, okay, what are the kind of core theoretical propositions of labour process theory? And as I say, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, merely to say that the argument really was that labour process theory's core concern is with the transformation of labour power. That labour power, the capacity to work for profitable production, is at the core of the reproduction of the capitalist enterprise. I'll come back to some of the characteristics for labour power in a minute. And therefore, labour process research is about the transformation of labour power in the context of different managerial and to some extent production regimes that are associated with particular types or stages of capitalism. And that these were informed by a structural antagonism, this is Paul Edwards' term, between capital and labour, a basic conflict of interests, albeit sometimes latent, which drove workplace transformations. And the best example of this is something like Richard Edwards' book, Contested Terrain, in which workplace regimes are regarded as part of this dialectic of control, resistance and consent, driving workplace transformations forward. So the goal of this approach was to identify what might be called strong tendencies which derive from the structural properties of the capitalist labour process. So something like the idea that there is a control imperative which derives from these antagonistic interests and from competition between different capitals. But leave open to empirical investigation what the specific mechanisms and outcomes were operative in particular conditions. So this is the point about, in the first 5 years after labour and monopoly capital, there were attempts by some people to try to elucidate so-called laws of the capitalist labour process. This is a big mistake. It's a big mistake scientifically, but it's a mistake empirically as well, in the sense that there are no connections between capitalist political economy as it's filtered through particular varieties of capitalism or sectors or firms which will ever sustain a law of the labour process to do with skills or control systems and so on. This has to be open to empirical investigation. As I said, part of this core theory was an attempt to focus on the qualities of labour power, particularly that fundamentally that it's indeterminate. In other words, the capital can only purchase the potential for profitable work. This has a lot of implications for things like control imperative and capacity for resistance and so on, but also that it's embodied. This is a phrase, embodied, that was not around in that period, but it's very fashionable now, so why not use it? And that labour power is also mobile. And so it has distinctive characteristics which make it different from other commodities and which drive the transformations in work relations. Now, want to say one more thing about the background theory, and that is the notion that part of this core theory argument was that the labour process has a relative autonomy within capitalism. when labour process approaches were at their peak, and certainly in the UK, they were completely dominant in social, and certainly in the sociology of work at one stage, so that every man and his dog thought they were a labour process theorist and used to come to these conferences and so on. There's always a price of hegemony. And those prices include things like, if everyone thinks they're in that theoretical box, they say things like, why hasn't labour process theory got a theory of the state, or a theory of patriarchy, or a theory of, you name it, whatever they're interested in, they want you to have a theory of it. This is the road to disaster. Theories of everything. I don't know about physics and string theory and that kind of stuff. You know, there's a whole theory of everything thing there, which I have no idea what they're talking about. Theories of everything in social science normally aren't very good because theoretical resources are a distinctive set of concepts that can be applied to a restricted range of empirical objects. That's my line. If you try and stretch them too far, they don't explain anything, or they explain something badly. So there were attempts by feminists during that period to take labour process theory and apply it to housework. Not a good idea. The concepts can't be applied to study housework because housework is a distinctive empirical object which has different characteristics than wage-labour relationships. So there were a group of us who said, right, let's narrow it down. For this we were attacked for being sectarian and narrow-minded and so on, but really it was an attempt to say you've got to have a theory of something, and it's got to be something which recognises, for example, the distinctiveness of the employment relationship. If you become a theory of everything, what happens is that once you cease to be fashionable, you end up with a theory of nothing because nobody likes you anymore. And that's what happens to things like, for example, we have this wave of really, in my view, unfortunate Foucaultian theorizing about work and organization, and now that's fashionable, nobody defends it. Nobody wants to do it anymore. They've moved on to the next fashionable object, and it's kind of dying now. The dying bit was good, but generally speaking, theory of everything, not a good idea. So what this meant to some extent was an attempt to narrow down, if you like, the object of analysis and theory development to the interaction between different forms of capitalist political economy, workplace regimes, and patterns of skill, control, resistance, and so on. And this was the chosen method for doing this was the embedded, sometimes ethnographic case study. Now, one of the interesting bits of the disentangling was that was disentangling labour as a workplace and societal actor. And there was a very conscious argument in this 1990 labour process theory book to produce some kind of post-Marxist account, as most of us in the 1980s ceased to be Marxists and ceased to feel guilt about ceasing to be Marxists. We tried to find ways of retaining an emphasis on capital and labour and the struggles of capital and labour, while getting rid of the gravedigger thesis. The idea, as I described, I don't know, it's terrible to quote yourself, but hey, that the idea that labour is a universal liberating class destined by its location in the process of production to be the gravedigger of capitalism. Now, you know, one can say that ceasing to believe in that is an article of faith, but empirically, what it meant was people felt that they were able to study capital and labour as actors in the workplace without constantly asking themselves, how is that struggle going to turn into revolutionary class consciousness or something of that nature. So that the burden of the gravedigger thesis was kind of jumped. And one of the interesting things is there's still quite a number of Marxists associated with labour process studies in the UK, but they seem to have accepted this. Not that they've accepted that the working class is not the gravedigger of capitalism. It's just that that's become a kind of Sunday school article of faith, which they occasionally make reference to, but it doesn't actually get in the way of the work they do. That's, if any of them were here, they'd probably be hitting me at this point, but they're not, so I can say that. And my argument is going to be, as we go on, that this notion of relative autonomy has uses and abuses. It has uses in the sense that we've just talked about. It meant opening up ways of studying the workplace, which were very innovative and didn't have to go down this, what does it mean for class consciousness thing all the time. But it also had abuses or problems in that it meant that certain forms of connection, things that fell outside the narrower confined basis, tended to kind of fall out of the picture a bit. So labour markets tended to disappear from the picture, probably not a good idea. The other circuits of capital, other than the productive circuit of capital, tended to disappear from it and so on, but we'll come back to that later. Now I'm just going to say something very briefly about two challenges that basically to the then hegemony of labour process theory in study of the workplace, two paradigm shifts happened from the late 80s, mid-80s on to the mid-90s. One was post-Fordism and new economies. The argument that changed conditions of competitiveness had increased the demand for flexible, autonomous and skilled workers. And the second paradigm shift was towards postmodernism and the cultural turn, with the argument that production, work and interest have been displaced by consumption, identity and immateriality. Immateriality is a relatively recent addition to it, but it's incredibly popular amongst postmodernists. I don't know whether in the UK at the moment. This is very influenced by Hart and Negri. I don't know if you've come across that stuff. Immateriality is basically intangibility with posh Marxist words. And the point about those two new paradigms was that the way that they were framed were in part designed to say that labour process theory was an old economy paradigm, old-fashioned, out of sync, out of date, because employment relationship doesn't really matter anymore, interest doesn't really matter, identity, consumption, on the one hand, or it's out of date because the modern workforce is flexible, autonomous, skilled, not like you said it was. Now, so a lot of labour process research in the 1990s was in fairly defensive mode. When somebody attacks you, the first thing you do is defend yourself. That's the academic equivalent of human nature, is it not? So there were two types of defensive reaction in a sense. So the largest form, and there were some very good American studies, including people like Ruth Miltman, who's associated with the US at UCLA, which were basically about the dark side of lean production, pointing to the continuity and constraints in workplace regimes and the capacity for worker resistance. But a huge amount of research was done about, if you like, in a kind of neo-Fordist kind of argument, but pointing out the downside to new workplace regimes and the continuity with the past. There was also a lot of attempts, of which I've made personally a fair number, to throw rocks back at postmodernists and to claim that production and the employment relationship still matter, that worker resistance and antagonistic interests are still driving forces of workplace transformation, pointing to continuities and new forms of service work which do not fit the picture. Some of this overlaps with the kind of work to some extent that Ritzer and other people were pointing to in terms of growth of routine services, and pointing to that the largest job growth in contemporary economies is low to mid-end service work, not high-end stuff. This introduced new concepts like emotional labour to the equation. And I mean, one thing that suddenly came our way was the growth of call centres. They are called call centres over here as well, aren't they? And of course, you know, call centres, which suddenly became, you know, the focal point for a lot of debate about the nature of service work, of course, were not like the high-end service jobs which were predicted by postmodernists. And I'd say a good 70% of the research in Europe on call centres is being done by labour process people. I mean, it's not to say that it's the only people that do it, but work like Taylor and Baines, early stuff in the late 1990s, and Assembly Line in the Head was the first major work, I think, anywhere that was done on call centres. And there's been a lot of stuff about control regimes and skills and so, just as an example. Now, on the back of that, after that defensive period, what I'm going to try and turn to is the idea that there's been a new wave of theory building, or at least concept construction. So, and having been given my kind of title with the word transformations in it by Chris, I decided I would stick to this and talk about 4 transformations in contemporary workplaces which labour process research has got something, I would argue, moderately interesting to say on it. First is the notion that we need to move beyond the upskilling versus de-skilling debate, which is really, in my view, a dead debate. It's not going anywhere. It is true that people still keep resuscitating upskilling arguments and using exactly the same arguments which Braverman knocked down at the time, like you can judge, you can evaluate the range of skills by how many qualifications people have got or what occupations they're in and so on. Towards, we need an expanded conception of skills. So clearly, the biggest and most interesting development in skills has been the rise of sometimes called soft skills, generic or extra functional skills, and Chris came, I think, to there's quite a number of sessions on this at the recent Labour Process Conference. And these skills are clearly different than traditional skills. They have less of a technical knowledge content to them, and so there's a lot of work being done on that. The other thing we need to grasp is the extent, I mean, you know, labour process theory, contemporary labour, does not make an argument. I haven't heard a de-skilling argument from anyone for 20 years. But there's certainly been other critiques of the notion of knowledge work, the idea that more and more people are knowledge workers. We put the emphasis on knowledge worked rather than knowledge work. And the emphasis, even in relatively routine manufacturing work, for example, that capital is trying to tap in to the tacit skills and knowledge of workers. It's not classic Taylorism, though there are still elements of Taylorism within the workplace. The other thing that's been written about considerably, is back to this labour power theme, is tapping in, mobilising the whole person, the hidden or previously untapped aspects of labour power. So I mentioned the emotional labour work stuff. And there was a woman called Sharon Bolton in the UK who's written a very, very good book from a labour process angle called Emotion Management. But the notion of aesthetic labour was developed by colleagues of mine, Chris Warhurst and Dennis Nixon, from my own department. And I mean, that does a labour process analysis of the way that in certain types of service work, capital seeking to mobilise the embodied or aesthetic qualities of labour in order to sell the product. I use the term in terms of the wider notion of the effort bargain, that in the past 20 years there's been a qualitative intensification of labour. If you like, more demanding work. This is a term that Francis Green, UK sociologist, labour economist, actually uses in his recent book. Now there are upmarket and downmarket versions of this. The upmarket versions you could categorise through things like communities of practice ideas, or amongst creative workers, or the notions of knowledge work, but even, knowledge management, but even knowledge management is very interesting. There's been very good labour process accounts of knowledge management, and you've got to look at the language used in knowledge management, capturing, converting knowledge, to see that this is about the tacit knowledges of more creative expert labourers, if you like. The down-market versions can be seen in things like call centres and so on. So there is basically evidence from surveys and case studies of rising work intensity and work intensification. In one very persuasive UK study recently, for example, more than 60% of workers reported increased intensity of work, and interestingly, professional workers were the most likely to report more intense work. Then you've got the link to things like time squeeze and what's people call negative job to home spillover. And in recent labour process work research, we describe this in terms in the increased elasticity of work. And this is again about labour power, an attempt by capital to squeeze more labour from us, but not necessarily in work, but across work-life boundaries as well. And then finally, there's the idea that there's been an extension of and more hybrid control systems. One of the most interesting research findings of recent years from the UK Skills Survey, but this has been confirmed across Europe as well, is falling discretion levels. So the amount of autonomy, if you like, or discretion exercised at work is falling in most sectors, in most countries in Europe. And interestingly, again, it's falling fastest in professional and technical workers, partly because they've got more to fall. I mean, you haven't got much in the first place, it's not going to fall very much, is it? So that might be the explanation for that. And this is to do, in part, with linked to enhanced surveillance of performance, including growth of audit and other accountability mechanisms amongst professional workers. And so what you're getting is hybrid management regimes in which, we have to, I'll come back to this later, move away from high road, low road distinctions. So there's a woman called Maeve Houlihan, an Irish researcher working in the labour process tradition, who argue that, particularly in call centres, that you've got these high commitment, low discretion models which kind of mix things which are not normally seen to be part, or are normally seen to be part of the package. Transformation to the employment relationship, I've already made this cautionary note. Labour process theory doesn't really do labour markets very much. But to make some observations from recent work, there's been a number of myths. I don't know whether you've had this Brazilianization argument. This is the Beck, German sociologist argument that European labour markets become Brazilianised, in other words, casualised. The idea that the end of work, end of job, none of this stands up to empirical scrutiny. Job tenure rates, for example, certainly in Europe, have not been falling, or at least they've been falling for men but rising for women, so they've been kind of equalising out. But there are some important developments taking place, particularly things like fragmented employment systems, outsourcing, more permeable organisational boundaries. One example of this, I was supervising a dissertation of an HR manager working for IBM in Scotland. And, well, I say working for IBM, she was working at an IBM plant, but she was actually working for an outsourced HR company. The IBM had outsourced the management of employees in the plant to them. But actually the IBM plant in itself was dictated to by a contract with an external source. So you had actually 3 layers, and so that the employees there were completely confused at who they were working for. And so this woman found that basically she had delegated responsibilities to manage the employment relationship without any of the levers available to manage it. She couldn't raise their pay, she couldn't change their grading structure, and you get the general point. There's been some very good research, particularly done by people at Manchester Business School, again, influenced by a labour process perspective, looking at the consequences for skill formation systems and so on for this, and for control structures and so on. And then you've got this move from notions of secure employment to employability. The emphasis on, I can illustrate this by, this is a thing that, again, a mid-level manager working for one of the big Edinburgh banks, the ones who've been disappearing recently, Royal Bank of Scotland and so on, gave to me that she had given to her at a meeting that they were all called through, and it's got old bank and new bank. And old bank is the bad, evil, old economy bank that everyone's supposed to hate now, and the new bank's the one everyone's going to go, whoopee, I'd really like to work at that new bank. And the old bank, you were not driven to excel, were employed in a paternalistic organisation, were not made redundant, had a job for life, had the same conditions and terms as everybody else. In the new bank, you will be driven to excel, have to look after number 1, can be made redundant and have a job but not a career.
Right.
Yeah, she was saying people were going out of the thing going, I really like that old bank. Combined with these previously noted trends on work intensity, one thing I've been arguing in recent publications is there's been a shift in the locus of insecurity from employment to work. In other words, as work relations have become more insecure because of the collectivization of effort and the decollectivization of risk, in other words, all the emphasis being on people putting more of themselves into their work, but being simultaneously told that they had to bear the burden of risk in terms of their skill and career development, work has become more insecure. And there's some very good evidence that, if I had time, I could take you through from surveys and case studies in Europe that indicate that. I'll leap over the HRM things and realise I'm probably going to run out of time soon. Worker agency point. Again, I'm trying to talk about research that's being done from a labour process perspective about different aspects of the workplace. Worker agency. If we take one step back, we see that in the early 1990s, we had a coincidence of 2 arguments, one from human resource management and one from Foucaultians and post-structuralists. both arguing the same thing, that workers had increasingly bought into new, particularly kind of organizational transformations, corporate cultures and so on, so that they were either committed, seduced or self-disciplined, therefore resistance in the employment relationship had disappeared. As you can imagine, we were not too impressed with that kind of argument. Even if you don't like any of the arguments that we make, actually that argument doesn't even stand up to conventional social science scrutiny. Case study and survey evidence of worker attitudes, certainly in the UK, shows declining morale and commitment and falling trust levels. And this has been a relative of a medium-term trend. You can imagine that in the next few years these things are likely to plummet significantly further. But there is a more interesting theoretical dispute about worker agency, what it is and how to see it. From a labour process angle, we've always treated the workplace as a contested terrain, looking at this dialectic of control, resistance, consent. So we are predisposed, through the concept of indeterminacy of labour, to treat employees as knowledgeable and adaptive actors, as opposed to kind of self-disciplining, seduced, what was that term? What structures to use? I can't remember now, but basically the agency had disappeared from the picture. Now, the major new conceptual development that's been used to grasp this is one that derives from work that I did with Stephen Ackroyd in a first of all in a journal article in the mid-90s, and then a book called Organizational Misbehavior. Come across it, but that's a big impact on research and has given people a kind of conceptual vocabulary to what I called ratchet down resistance. The problem with the term resistance is that it's a high bar. If you want to look, so if you're going to say, well, is resistance present in a workplace or not, you're looking really for intentional, collective, organized forms. And if they're not there, there's a tendency to go, well, then there is instead commitment and control. Now, if you use the language of misbehavior, what you're trying to do, without ignoring the issue of resistance, is to look at contested appropriation of time, work, effort, and identity. This argument had so much effect that it appeared to have even won over the Foucaultians, so much now that in the 10 years afterwards, now everything's resistance for them. I read this thing out at the recent labour process conference, I brought it with me. There's a special stream at this year's Critical Management Studies conference in the UK on food as resistance. Trust me, it's not. Otherwise, that lunch I just ate, I'm not quite sure where it would fit on the resistance spectrum, but apparently if you don't eat at work, that's resistance, or if you eat everything in sight at work, that's resistant. Anyway, it's not, but you know, they're determined to find resistance in every crack, nook and cranny of it. So, you know, the unintended consequences of good concepts, you just never know where they're going to go. Finally, transformations in political economy. Clearly, does anyone use the term post-Fordism now? I hope not. It's certainly after Fordism, but not post-Fordism. One of the interesting things, of course, people used the terms like the knowledge economy, didn't they? Instead of, sorry, I'm just rescuing something here. Instead of post-Fordism. And one of the interesting things about the recent financial crisis is the disappearing discourse of the knowledge economy. Our UK Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, he stole all the stuff from Robert Reich, you know, the Clinton's Labour Secretary. They've been rambling on about how we live in a knowledge economy where the traditional factors of production, capital, labour and so on, you know, don't really matter anymore. And that's all we got for about 10 years. In the past year since the crisis, the words knowledge economy have not passed his lips once. Now, I would have thought this: if you really lived in a knowledge economy, it's that would go into crisis, and therefore we'd have a crisis of the knowledge economy. We don't have a crisis of the knowledge economy; we have a crisis of financialized capitalism. This is not just post hoc theorizing. This is a pamphlet I wrote a few years ago, Skating on Thin Ice, the Knowledge Economy Myth. I'll leave that for anyone who's interested. I'll send them on copies. So, what labour process theory has been doing in recent years is trying to reconstruct an idea of what is the political economy that we have to connect workplace regimes to. And this might be a controversial bit, that in a sense, labour process theory has tended, in the absence of a robust notion of political economy, to rely on notions of varieties of capitalism. Now, varieties of capitalism, which is a kind of institutional theory argument, is okay, but the problem is that there's too much variety, not enough capitalism. And therefore, whereas labour process theory would tend to look at trends across sectors, categories, industries, and whatever, the problem with varieties of capitalism is that it tends to always look for the national difference first. And, you know, we tend to add the national difference in afterwards. But the two are compatible. But we're trying to look at the reproduction of labour power on an increasingly global scale. If you look at the kind of industry that I'm looking at, visual effects, its heart is here in LA. Its value chain is global. It makes no sense to look at national institutions, or not in, let's rephrase that, it doesn't make much sense to put that at the centre of analysis in a lot of the new global value chains which are emerging across industries. So what we've been looking at is new categories like, you know, trying to use value chain analysis, or to develop arguments about the rise of shareholder value and financialized capitalism. There's a lot of stuff being written on this. I wrote this thing a few years back in Work, Employment and Society called Disconnected Capitalism, Why Employers Can't Keep Their Side of the Bargain. And it's an attempt to argue what kind of fallout there's been from shareholder value regimes to growing instability in work and employment relations. So, in other words, we're trying to innovate in the sphere of political economy. Final slide. If there's one thing that bores me more than the de-skilling or upskilling, it's high road or low road. We've really got to dump this stuff. You know, it's not getting us anywhere because all you get is some roads are high, some roads are low. Or there's more low roads than high roads. And, you know, that's okay. I mean, clearly, you know, that might be the outcome of something. But one of the interesting things, I think, about trends is that they're actually paradoxical. They're not either low road or high road. And I'm trying to list some of those paradoxes there between creative work and destructive markets. In other words, that some developments in the labour process are actually towards high-performance creative work, but they're undermined and destabilised by the destructive market context of shareholder value, etc., that they are embodied in. One interesting paradox, I think, is you need to disentangle high-performance work systems, because what you've got is the high performance without the system. Because the system is the things that are supposed to underpin the high performance, but you don't get it, you just get the high performance. So that's a paradox. But I don't want to go down to, it's all low performance. Just, I mean, labour process theory is, I mean, we had this thing where a guy once came to labour process conference and said, you know, things are actually quite good. And of course you got 50 people standing and go, they're shit. They're absolutely awful. We have it's really bad. We have that franchise. But, you know, it's a rubbish franchise. Because things aren't all bad. They're paradoxical. They're kind of hybridized a lot of the time. And so One, again, other paradox is that if you look at the research evidence, more and more people, particularly women, have strong identification with work and take pleasure from work. On the other hand, if you look at trends in work systems, the trend is towards damaging the psychological contract and the effort bargain. Now, all these things are very, result in turbulent work environments. And obviously, the fallout from the financial crisis is going to be, considerable. And we have to figure, this out. A lot of the things we've taken for granted in the next few years are going to be things that we've got to think of again. So in terms of what labour process theory needs to do now, it needs, in my view, a phase of theory building that integrates all this stuff and reconnects the political economy and work systems that we've let drift a bit. And we've got to start moving more beyond the point of production, away from case study driven or organisation-centric case studies to multi-method, multi-leveled analyses. There's been a big influence from the growth of critical realism research philosophy in Europe, which has influenced this new way of thinking. So, not a very big bang end, but we should leave it there.
You can just call on people.
Yeah, feel free.
Can I start with your last PowerPoint? What does labor process theory need to do now? I mean, I'm kind of struck by the fact that what you put down there actually is what people in this country for the past 20 years have been doing. Not under the rubric of labor process theory or even within the management school. Actually, I don't know what management school people here do in this country do. But I think in sociological work, I mean, this is what the whole field has been doing for more than 12, now 30 years. And taking the labor process out of this isolated, disembedded kind of vacuum and putting that under in all kinds of connections with the state, with changes in the global economy, with gender, race. I mean, none of these you mentioned. So I was wondering, I mean, it seems to me that maybe it's because of the Atlantic divide between the US and UK or Europe, or maybe because it's institutional, disciplinary kind of boundary, but I mean, there's been a lot of work since Braverman that talks about multi-method, multi-level analyses, as well as the economy, what the state has done to change the workplace, and how worker systems sort of are being shaped by state policies. So we have lots of theories about women workers in the workplace and how gender transformed the labor process, not just labor process transformed gender relations. Same with race and citizenship status, undocumented workers, casualization, all kinds of issues that goes beyond very confined lengths of labor process. I mean, we do labor process, but not in and of itself. I'm totally ignorant of what is happening in the UK, but maybe because of the kind of professional organization that you still have a group of people that identify yourself as labor process theorists, so you tend to talk within that kind of boundary. So I try to be provocative here. So.
Maybe take a couple more rather than just get.
I wonder if the word globalism comes up, and that it seems like one of the things that sort of happened in this period is that there's a kind of an externalization of causation. So I'm your employer and I'm giving you bad news about working conditions and so on, but it isn't really me. It's this sort of external thing about which nobody can do much of anything, and I'm just sort of an instrument that happens to be bringing this news to you, but you can't blame the messenger for it. And I think a lot of people sort of have, over the last 2-3 decades, kind of have come to accept that, which may be one of the reasons why you see less worker resistance and so on. After all, it's just sort of a God-given cause if you sort of take it to the point of, well, you go to your political leaders and say, well, there's this thing out there that's causing me grief, do something about it, and they will say, well, we really can't, because this is much bigger than the nation state. This is globalism. So it seems like there is sort of behind a lot of what you're talking about is this sort of general perception that in some sense the things that go on in the workplace are merely reflections of some larger forces about which nobody has any control.
I would love to hear how you think some of the new labor process concepts handle the idea of managers. I mean, you talk about a structural antagonism between capital and labor. Managers are sometimes seen as representatives of capital, but then we have layers of middle management. So I would be interested to hear where you stand on that.
Okay. That's for a start. Provocation's fine. Look, you know, in one sense, it is, as you say, a reflection of trying to do an auto-critique of, you know, we know what we've traditionally been good at, which is organization-centric, qualitative case studies. And that has retained a kind of space to see things and to study things which are often lost. This is not a methodological point. It's, you know, as much a point about your orientation to where transformations take place, where you can see them, what you study, and so on. So one of the reasons why we were able to successfully repel the idea that resistance has disappeared from the workplace is because you don't see resistance and misbehaviour through surveys and, you know, things of that nature. You only really see it in qualitative, often ethnographic case studies. But I think that there's a wider point that I'm not. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I went to the American Sociological Association conference last year, which was supposedly on work. Was it?
Well, there
Yeah.
were there were.
Sorry?
I wasn't-
Well, let's put it this way. Good conference, don't get me wrong, and it was certainly better than the American Academy of Management, which I've been punished by being sent to a few times. But it, I found that I hunted through that huge program to look for people doing stuff on work relations at the workplace level, and found a handful, literally a handful of things. So if there's stuff going on about the labour process, I didn't see a lot of it. And I'm not saying, you know, labour process theory, which is a different point altogether. So it depends on what level we're talking about. Well, I'm talking about connecting workplace transformations to broader either sector or value chain analysis in it, then linked to types or varieties of capitalism. That's the multi-level I'm talking about. Now, there can be other multi-level stuff, which is presumably what you're talking about, which, you know, and you're right, good research across the social sciences doesn't really differ in terms of its orientation. But and you're right, I mean, there may well be research that I don't know of in the US. But the type of research that I'm more used to seeing from people that I like and respect in the US is more comparative, sector-based stuff that's really influenced by institutional theory, which is okay, you know, but is, I think, reaching the end of its period. I mean, this thing that Chris has been involved in the SAGE Foundation. Were you at the Paris meeting?
Not that one, no.
I was asked to go to an international gathering of this SAGE Low Wage Foundation thing, and there's got your classic. You could call it multi-level, but the multi-level is the state is the highest level in this analysis. Capitalism as a category does not exist, in my view, other than variety of capitalism. And a lot of the comments that were made there by people developing this argument seem to recognize similar things, because when they were looking at the actual trends in key sectors, you couldn't explain them through a variety of capitalism lens anymore, or you couldn't explain them very well. So, yeah, but there's different types of multi-level analysis, and I'm not sure you quite cracked it in the States as much as you think you have. The other points, the globalism one, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's some fascinating work being done now about outsourcing, for example, of financial services, and particularly in call centres, which again creates problems for a conventional national institution-based kind of argument. But it's. I mean, I think the general point that I would make is that that more and more sectors, the value chains that are of more and more sectors are constructed globally with less connection, that are less deeply embedded through national institutions. And actually labour process theory is reasonably well equipped to address that, because it's less, we've kind of traded with institutional theory, because you have to, because institutions do matter. But, on the other hand, we're capable of looking at more. The managers thing is an interesting argument, because if you look at classic second wave labour process theory, it uses notions of managerial regime in one way or another. And one question, quite rightly, that was thrown at labour process theory in this period was, okay, who are the agents in this regime? I mean, you can't just use a category that obliterates agents, either individual managerial agents or groups, sub-functions or divisions of management. So there's some really interesting stuff done in the 80s and 90s by people like Peter Armstrong, looking at levels and competition of different what we would tend to do is to try and look at management as a labour process in itself, and the various categories and layers of management that there are. We've not any great interest in individual managerial agents, not because we haven't got the tools to analyse that, not because it doesn't matter. And there's some very good stuff. If you look at last year's Work Employment Society, some very good stuff from a labour process angle, looking at what's happening to middle managers by a team that was looking at managerial work in different countries. Anyway, the name will come to me. But again, they're based at Manchester. So, I mean, the orientation would be to certainly treat managers as both connected and independent actors, i.e. connected through the circuits of capital to their companies and employers, but also to treat them as having a labour process in their own right. And there's a lot of evidence on the growing intensification of middle management work in the period of restructuring and downsizing that took place from the kind of early 90s onwards. I'm sorry.
As a relative outsider, I'm kind of impressed with the notion of resistance. And I worked for a lot of years over in school education. helping counselors primarily, but working also with teachers. And we don't get across the notion of resistance, and I feel in broader psychology, we move more into manualized treatment. And you mentioned here, you really take away more and more of the autonomy of the professional with that type of operation. It makes some sense, at least in the short run, to have that kind of device. But our notion that this is a contested area, we certainly don't teach that. We teach it in the ethics class that we would teach. We say if there's behavior that's hurting people, you kind of avoid that. You're trying to contain that and stop that. But in terms of when your professional activities, and it kind of strikes me that right now you have the layoff notices sent to all the teachers, and to a lot of teachers. And years ago, one of my students did a very good study on people who were laid off in the early 80s and what happened to them. And I think subsequent studies have shown the same thing. You're going to lose from the profession and from the less advantaged school districts, you're going to lose good teachers, very constructive teachers, and yet the teachers don't seem to be resisting very strongly, if at all. I mean, there's some murmurs, but so the notion there, we haven't learned. When I had a summer job as a student, somebody tried to recruit me to be a steam fitter, and I went to one of their picnics, and it was a very different take on the relationship steam fitters had, and I've almost forgotten it with their employer organization, and that's not all present from my perspective. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or this kind of, if that's in this side of the pond that we have lost. I mean, people kind of think we're moving up, and Joe the plumber, he's not worried about the situation, but he's going to move up into the upper class. That kind of mentality.
I have a second try, because I think I didn't make my point clearly. You misread, didn't make clear that my point was not really methodological, it was really theoretical, that by ignoring all these kind of extra production institutions and look at the labor process as such a workplace per se level, the workplace became just, it remained, I should say, a site of contested terrain between two classes, but ignoring that it was also the site for constitution and politics of gender and race and citizen versus non-citizen, and all these other kinds of power that is not, that you can't reduce, that cannot be reduced to class. And so the reason why in this country people have been working as sociology of work in general and not subject and don't use the labor process is perhaps because that kind of labor process paradigm brings with it a class first analysis theoretically that people may not be using or see as adequate. And so, and case studies, qualitative methods, there are many different ways of doing it. I teach students to do that in a global way, comparative technology. So it's well accepted and established, but I think that's even a lesser point in the theoretical underpinning of labor process theory, because methods is just a tool to get at our answers. And so.
Well, this is a more empirical question. I was just very taken with the phrase you threw out from Mae Houlihan of commitment without discretion. And certainly a lot of the industries that I study, that's their holy grail, is commitment without discretion. And it just seems to me that there's only so many ways to get commitment. I mean, one is just the whip of unemployment. That can always keep people committed. A second is some kind of effort bargain, whether it's a wage premium, whether it's long-term employment, but there's less and less of that. A third sort of set of things is things like making it fun for young people or treating older people with respect. Bethany Morton gave a colloquium in this series where she said, there's lots and lots, there's hundreds of thousands of women who love working at Walmart because they get treated with respect in a way they don't in the home. Even if they may not make it into management, they get treated with a certain level of respect. But you know, ultimately, if you can't give long-term rewards, you probably have to give some discretion. And so I guess the question is sort of surveying that literature. I see so many companies that, you know, like a company that was cutting wages, cutting benefits, and then saying, we've started an engagement program.
Yeah.
It's like, well, good luck, guys. And so you know, empirically, has anybody, are companies, are workers being seduced? Have companies figured their way out of this box, or do you sort of end up falling back on the same set of tools that companies have always had to elicit commitment?
Okay, let me start with that one. I think, let me take one step back to the conceptual point I was trying to make here is there's actually been both less research on control systems compared to the 80s and an emphasis that what employers have been focusing on, if you want to use labour process languages, normative controls and commitment programs and engagement programs and so on, one could argue, were normative control programs. Now, one of the interesting things about the growth of call centres was because it was something new and because it was growing so rapidly, it became a kind of laboratory to look at this afresh. And so, and it also broke through this high road, low road, different, you know, kind of stereotype as well. And, but it's not, as you say, untypical of a number of types of service work where at least formalized expressions of commitment are expected of people. I mean, my daughter did a sub-degree in fashion retail or something or other, you know, and when she started to go for jobs with fashion chain, she'd always, you know, she'd ring Dad up and say, you know, I'm going for an interview with X, you know, tell me about them, and you know, I'd kind of look it up and, you know, and she always got the job, right, because she was the only one who ever knew anything about this thing. And of course, one of the things that is the ludicrous expectation that in relatively routine jobs that one should be passionate, literally the word passionate, which I think should be reserved for private sphere, you know. Passionate about the work. Nobody who works for these things is passionate about the work. There might be other things, I mean, you know, but of course, at the interview stage, if you repeat this rubbish, you know, the kind of rituals of commitment, they love you. My daughter said that literally the first time she would see, the woman virtually leapt across the table, you know, when she fed back some of this corporate culture bullshit. It had no connection to the work at all, which was heavily controlled, routinized, you know, the degree of discretion. And they aren't going to add discretion into it either, anytime soon. And of course they get there for height. There's got to be a price, as you say. They can't sustain commitment without something in return. And it can either be discretion, progression, you know, it's got to be something. If it's not something, then they're going to get the high turnover, or people, you know, that's what they're getting. I mean, there's various attempts to create proxies for commitment. I think it's the interesting ones. If you take call centres, I wrote this article a few years ago called Teams Without Teamwork, about call centres. Go in virtually every call centre, certainly in Europe, and you find teams. What are they there for? There's no teamwork. I mean, the work is completely atomised and individualised, and what they're there for is proxies for commitment. phony forms of discretion, like you can choose a colour for the corner where your team meets. No, seriously. You know, you can decorate your space with X. And actually, when you actually interview people of this, I'd say about 1 in 100 is remotely convinced by this. Or they have proxy reward systems, like, you know, a night out with the boss. I'm making that up. You know. But, you know, a night out, you know, or you know, some kind of, or you get their name put up on, you know, some thing. And so it doesn't really work. They're all proxies for commitment. Actually, if you look at the language of commitment, is slowly disappearing, I think, from workplace discourses, which tells us something of even they don't think it's sustainable. Resistance, I'm saving the most contentious to the end. If you, there's parallel debates about resistance in the US as well. You know, one of them is about the kind of thing you're talking about, which is, if you like, formal collective organization or action. Is it declining? Why is it declining? How can it be renewed? I love those debates, but we don't do them. You know, that's not our thing. And one of the interesting reasons it's not our thing is that if you go back to the labour process under Fordism, what you find is, and if you look at the classic studies, literally, of Ford and GM and the struggles there and so on, but you could go into engineering and, you know, other sectors as well, what you find is a very close connection between informal workplace struggles and formal ones. The British shop steward system, for example, which was the strength of collective union organisation, was actually built on informal job controls. Those links have been broken. They've been broken more or less everywhere, and they ain't coming back. And therefore, what you've got is almost two parallel debates. How can we retain collective voice and organisation so that people will do something about the terrible things which are done to them, which is a kind of union renewal and or wider kind of debate. And then there's a debate which we kind of do, but not because we don't like the other debate, but just because it's different, which is what's going on beneath the surface at the workplace. What is in place of these informal job controls? So it's like informal resistance, informal misbehaviour, collective and individual. And this gets us out of a hole, which is these people who argue that because union density is falling, that indicators of class or collective organisation, you know, so that they simply read off from one indicator the disappearance of collective forms of resistance. And if you are orientated towards looking at the informal, then you don't fall prey to that kind of argument. But the two are entirely compatible, but it's about kind of connections between them. Your point, I'm sorry, I couldn't remember your name, but would be a good one if it was true. I.e., that labour process theory is a class first argument. It is up to a point, but I think you're really hitting the wrong target here. Because we disentangled ourselves from the gravedigger thesis, we have no burden. We don't do class analysis in the convention. We have no emotional or intellectual investment in the idea that you always start with class and the class matters more than gender. You know, we look at labour and labour power. That labour power can be gendered, it can be racialised, it can be anything you like. You know, it's only class to the extent that we look at labour and capital. A lot of the classic UK labour process studies done in the 80s, for example, were studies of female wage labour. And you still get it. It just isn't true.
Well, if you treat worker as a neutral, abstract, universal worker.
Well, we don't. That's the point. Labour power does not, well, it exists at a level of abstraction. You can say certain things about labour power at a high level of abstraction. It is indeterminate. It is embodied.
Can I jump in? Because I thought your point was not just about difference, but also about multiplicity. And I think what she's asking you to do is to concede that U.S. labor sociology might have something to offer in terms of your call for attention to multiple systems, multiple levels, multiple identities, which may be overlapping, but that there's not just, you're not just female and you're not just a working class and so on.
Yes, it's part of the argument.
Let make the point of it. Where I think there is a weakness in the approach that we take is, and it is embedded in your question, is that relative autonomy can become too autonomous, like variety to capitalism. Like ultimately, there can become too much variety into capitalism. It's not that that there's any predisposition not to look at labour in its gendered or other forms, but that tends to be, if the labour is gendered in the workplace you go and look at, if you see what I mean. And what's often been lost is the connection to wider theorizations of gender and ethnicity and so on. So it's excessive autonomy. I mean, that is the problem. Not class first. There's no class first orientation at all in labour process theory, much to the chagrin of orthodox Marxists who would be, see what I mean, who would be kind of criticising for it. Where your argument, would be true is if we'd have followed Burrowoy's line in manufacturing consent. Because he made an argument of complete autonomy. He's known for his argument about consent and games in the workplace, which was very original. But he also made an argument that one could treat social relations in the workplace in a complete closed system sense. And he actually made an argument that they were not influenced at all by external, so-called external, higher level, whatever we're going to know. And I mean, but I'm not overpraise myself, but if you look at my 1983 Nature of Work book, I mean, I hit that one well on the head then, and I don't know anyone, labour process theorist, who's followed that line, and I don't think he even follows it himself. But you're right. There's a sense in which we've often lost touch with these larger picture issues, but only because we've focused excessively on micro level stuff, some of which is gendered.
We should wrap up. Thanks very much, Paul.